If you're struggling with health challenges that you've been unable to resolve, like gut problems, constipation, gas or loose stools, low energy, sleeplessness, brain fog, or even hormone issues like low sex drive, anxiety, or weight gain, go to livelongerformula.com/FKN or use the link in the description and book a free health assessment with my friend Christian Yordanov. Christian is a longevity author and functional health practitioner, and he will help you get your gut working smoothly, detox yourself, boost your testosterone, sleep like a baby, and function at your best, because you deserve to be at your best and thrive, not just survive. Go to livelongerformula.com/FKN where you can watch his latest free masterclass on the 7 deadly health fads that are shortening your life. After watching the masterclass, if his approach resonates with you, you can book a free metabolic function assessment with Christian so he can help you identify the root causes of your health problems. Make sure you mention my name, Chris Matthew, when booking your session, and you're going to get a free gift if you decide to work with him. Again, go to livelongerformula.com/FKN or use the link right in the description and take control of your health right now.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Cory Hughes. Be sure and check out my films. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime. We are booking guests for May. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Cory Hughes. He is an author, researcher, host of Bloody History, and co-host of Day Zero podcast. Cory, welcome back. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me. It's been a bit.
Yes, it has. It's great to have you back. You have 2 new recent books, Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White, and your second edition, first volume of A Warning from History. In my perspective, you offer some of the most in-depth research surrounding the assassination of JFK, with new revelations that not many or none at all have found some of this information. So today we're going to share some of the latest JFK revelations covered in your new books. Before we do, remind the audience just a bit about yourself and let them know how they can find more.
Sure. My name's Cory Hughes. I'm an ex-cop and ex-crime scene investigator. And when I got out of law enforcement, I made the decision to become a Kennedy researcher. And that's what I've been doing for about the last 8 years. July will be 8 years that I've been doing Kennedy almost full time. And at this point, let me see, I got what will soon be 3 books out on the assassination. A Warning from History came out in October 2023, about 2.5 years ago. It's done very well. Probably sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 copies, give or take. And it was time to update the book, and so I did. And so what we have here is A Warning from History, Volume 1, which is, I've increased the size. It's an 8.5 by 11 sized book. And what I've done is I've included all of the various documents and pictures and all the things that people really, I thought, needed to see to accompany the text itself. And it ended up being a 2-volume set because it was so big. It's going to be around 750 pages total between the 2 books. And that's just, you can't put out a book that big these days. Amazon won't let you. So it had to be 2 volumes. And I'm really proud of it. I think this is going to be, once it's both parts are out, I think it's going to be the best Kennedy volumes that have ever been published.
Well, right on. Since we last spoke, we discussed the book Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White. What primarily does the first edition of this new book cover?
It covers the first 6 chapters of the original Warning from History, which basically is all of the relevant people, right? I took the six chapters cover Oswald, Carrie Thornley, David Ferry, all of the New Orleans crew, the mercenaries, and Jack Valenti, who's one of the most important people in the entire assassination story. And that's what falls into this first volume. It's actually pretty long. It's around 350 something pages long. And all of the supporting documents and photographs that I felt needed to be in there to kind of emphasize the point, they're all there. And that's something that most of the Kennedy books don't do. They don't include photographs. A couple do, but I've never actually seen a book that was constructed in the manner that I put this together. Some people try to take the documents and they'll put them in a book, and the book will be like an 8.5 by like 6 book. It's not big enough to really see what's going on in the document. And so I wanted the documents to basically be as close to full size as you could get. And that's why I went with this 8.5 by 11 format. And honestly, the feedback I've been getting on it is absolutely stellar. And thank you once again to Johnny Larson for the cover designs.
With each new edition, you also include a little bit of new information and tweaks that you have found along the way. So maybe we should do a basic refresher for everyone about some of the information that you include in the book. You have come up with a lot of updates for the original information that my audience probably hasn't heard yet. So let's go through the chapters without giving away too much, because we want them to go and buy the book. Starting with Lee Harvey Oswald, what is primarily focused on surrounding him?
So Lee Harvey Oswald is certainly the patsy of the story. So the thing is that Oswald, I believe, was part of a lifelong naval intelligence project to get a spy into the Soviet Union, which eventually was taken over by the CIA at some point. He goes over there and he comes back, but when he comes back, he brings Marina with him, right? His wife with the glassy eyes, right? So I noticed when I looked at pictures of Trump's wife and Marina Oswald, they both have they have a dead eye stare, you know. I don't know what that's from, but it's the same exact
that MK Ultra honeypot.
Right, it's the Russian MK Ultra. It's 100%. You just nailed it. Okay, so, but he brings back Marina, and Marina's clearly a spy. Okay, like her uncle was like one of the big shots in the Russian army and the KGB, and so the odds. And also, there was a previous defector named Robert Webster who was ended up being naval intelligence and sent over there. Well, it turns out she knew Robert Webster also. She was put in the same apartment building as him and formed some sort of a relationship with him. And then she gets with Oswald, who's another false defector, right? So she's clearly a Russian honeypot, and she ends up coming back to the States with Oswald. And I feel that kind of sealed his fate. You know, what are you doing bringing this Russian spy back with you, right? Because it's obvious to me, at least, when he got back, despite the fact there's little documentation of this, they are not going to let a Russian spy just wander around. I have no doubts that they kept ultra high tabs on her from the day she got back, the day she got here to America. And so I think that's kind of the reason that they ended up using him and setting him up, because they were pissed that he brought a spy back with him, right? So that's kind of there's not really much evidence for that other than when you understand the totality of circumstances, that just seems like the most logical thing. And so he ends up being set up, but the setup of Oswald really is strange because it goes back to like 2 years before he ever came back from the Soviet Union. One of the first incidents we have where they're clearly setting Oswald up happened in February of 1961, where a man goes to the Bolton Ford in New Orleans, tries to get a price quote for a bunch of Jeeps and stuff to send to Cuba, and he gives the name Lee Oswald. Okay, so Lee Oswald is provably still in the Soviet Union at this time. So why would they do that? Why would they start to use Oswald's name when it's provable that he's in the Soviet Union? Nobody has an answer to that question. Okay, it might have been sloppy work. Who the hell knows? But there's about a half a dozen incidents where Oswald is encountered, and in one case even arrested at a time when he's provably still in the Soviet Union. Okay, so there were a couple people using his name. Carrie Thornley was the one who was primarily using his name down in New Orleans. And so once Oswald gets back in June of 1962, he's bounced back and forth between Fort Worth and New Orleans. And it appears as though they are starting to set up a second plot to get Oswald into Cuba. Okay. So it appears as though the maintaining of his communist bona fides and all his communist talk was meant to perpetuate a second plot to get him into Cuba. That never happened. The assassination ends up happening, and it seems as though he was repurposed from being this spy in communist countries to being the patsy for the assassination. Okay. They did a really poor job. Well, I guess for the time, for the 60s, they did a great job at setting Oswald up. But in hindsight, when you come to understand what they did to set Oswald up, how they sent people like William Seymour and Carrie Thornley to a bunch of different places to go act like a communist and talk about Russia, talk about your Russian wife, it was clear that they were setting up Oswald to take the fall for something long before there ever could have been an assassination plot. But the actual plot for the assassination, I believe, came about sometime in the late 62, early 63, because by March of 1963, we have the ordering of the rifle, right, and the handgun that are allegedly used to kill the president and to kill Officer J.D. Tippit. When you dig into the stories of these weapons, it becomes very clear he had nothing to do with ordering this rifle or this handgun. Both the rifle and the handgun ended up being imported to the country by a CIA contractor, Adams Consolidated, run by a guy named Samuel Cummings, right? It was all CIA. The Carcano rifle came in a batch of 70. And the story is that Oswald ordered the rifle from Klein's Sporting Goods, but the Klein's paperwork is all a mess. According to Klein's, the rifle was ordered the first week of March, but the money order that was used to pay for it was deposited in their bank in mid-February. So according to Klein's, they received and deposited the money order weeks before it was ever sent, right? So we have some major problems with the documentation of that. We have all kinds of problems with the size of the rifle compared to what was ordered. There was a 3 or 4 inch differential between what was received and what was allegedly ordered. So there's a lot of problems. And then it turns out that Klein's is actually a CIA cutout and employed a bunch of CIA agents after the assassination happened. So Oswald had nothing to do with ordering the rifle and any of that stuff. But he did make a very good patsy. And the impersonations of Oswald were necessary in order to perpetuate this myth of him being a communist and stuff. And I believe this impersonation happened up to and including his employment at the book depository, where I can't put Oswald ever in that building.
The story behind Lee Harvey Oswald gets so wild. You include a lot of it in the book Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White. His family has long-running intelligence ties. This is actually a theme that comes up in many of these operations. Some of the highest level players involved come from multi-generational intelligence families where their parents were involved and their grandparents were involved, and they may not even have a clear picture of what they're involved with.
Yes.
Right.
That's what I've concluded about Oswald. You see, back in the day, everybody went into the military, okay? In like the 20s and 30s, and especially the 40s, every male of fighting age joined the military. I'd say like 90%. It was just what you did. You know, it was just kind of a way to get you off the ground and get you started. Yeah, World War I. Robert Oswald and his brother Harvey Francis Oswald were in the Army. Robert was a sergeant. But there's not really any information on that. I've tried pulling up military records, and it's just too far back. I mean, it's almost 100 years ago, and they don't turn up in the standard databases. Most of the standard databases don't really pick up anything pre like 1940-ish. You know, any documents from before 1940, very hard to come by. But it appears as though not only Robert and his brother were involved in the military, but the more I dug into Marguerite Oswald and her family, it appears, I would say with absolute certainty, that her sister, Lillian Moret, was involved in intelligence 100% in the 1950s. And this never came up in the Warren Commission. She was never questioned about this. This information didn't come out until I found it about, I don't know, less than a year ago. But Lillian Moret was flying back and forth between New Orleans, Florida, and Cuba, and also making trips to Montreal which doesn't make any sense because you're not supposed to be flying to Cuba in the mid 1950s. It's not one of those places people actually went, but she did. And there's no reason for it. She was a housewife, literally, allegedly, had no career, was just a housewife. But yet we have documents showing that she was flying, especially in 55 and 56, when Oswald, right before he joins the Marines. I have documentation that her and her daughter, Marilyn Moret, flew to an Air Force base, Kindley Air Force Base, which is in Bermuda in 56. This is highly unusual. There's no reason that they should have been flying to Air Force bases. Nobody in that family was in the Air Force. There's no reason for it whatsoever, but yet they went there and they stayed there for about 6 days before flying back to New York and then back to New Orleans. So we have this stack of documents showing that the family was involved in doing things that are inexplicable unless you're in intelligence, right? And then when you go over the testimony of Lillian Moret at the Warren Commission, this woman couldn't remember anything. She couldn't remember where her sister worked certain times. She basically took Lee Harvey Oswald and raised him in his earliest years, and then before he was put into the Bethlehem orphanage. And the problem with this is that she says she was watching him because Marguerite was, had no money and she was poor and she was out trying to, just get by and make a living and all this stuff. She couldn't remember where her sister worked. But the problem is that in her own words, she admitted in one page of a book that she wrote in the mid 1960s that she worked at the naval base in Algiers, Louisiana. Okay. So when you look at the timing of all this stuff, when she worked at the naval base, it becomes brutally obvious that Marguerite Oswald had joined what was called the Navy Waves program. And so in World War II, all the men go off to war, and the domestic positions here in the States needed to be filled. And they couldn't just recruit everybody into the Navy again, right, to refill those. They had to open it up to civilians, and they created a ton of civilian jobs for women in particular to fill the jobs of the men who went off to war. And so this program doesn't get much attention, but once you dig through the history of Marguerite Oswald, it becomes very clear that she was part of this program. And this program went from around May of 42 until 44. And it's funny because it's not until around April of 1944 that Marguerite Oswald kind of reappears. So between 41 and 44, you can't say nobody on planet Earth can tell me what she was doing. She's lied about her schedule. Her sister lied about what she was doing. And why would her sister lie about her being in the Navy? You think her sister didn't know she had joined the Navy, was working at a Navy base, and that's why she was watching Oswald, and she had to lie about that? Well, obviously, it showed me that they were trying to hide the fact that Marguerite Oswald was involved in naval intelligence. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Because when she testified at the Warren Commission, she acknowledged that she was a phone operator for the Navy. In order to be a phone operator, you had to have the highest level security clearance because you're connecting guys on the phone lines like generals and stuff, and those guys have the highest security clearance, and you could overhear every conversation. So they had to ensure every phone operator had the highest security clearance. So what does that mean? It means Marguerite Oswald had the highest level Navy security clearance all the way back in 1942, 43, and 44. Period. From her own words, this is the only logical deduction that can be had. Then when you start to get into the conflict with Lee Harvey Oswald, you'll find that from like 42 all the way to 56, Oswald's in two places at once. You start to come across the Harvey and Lee stuff where basically I concluded they're brothers. Okay. This is another brother that was had by Marguerite Oswald. And you got to think in 1940, if you had a child out of wedlock, you're a whore. Okay. And so they would go to great lengths to hide illegitimate children back then. And then I feel like once naval intelligence got onto the notion that she had another child, then they went and they ran with it and turned it into an intelligence operation, which to me becomes clear once you get into like Oswald's schooling post like 46 doesn't make any sense whatsoever. When he went to Russia, he wrote out like a biography of himself, and that biography that he wrote out totally contradicts the official story on where he was, when he went to school, where he went to school, the whole 9 yards. So there's so much contradiction in Oswald's life. It becomes brutally obvious that there were two people who were being raised under the name Lee Harvey Oswald. And that is what is covered in Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White Volume 1. Now, as soon as I finish up this Warning from History Volume 2, which will be done in the next couple weeks, I'm going to get back onto my Oswald studies because I'm really fascinated by Oswald's time in the Marine Corps, where this duplicate Oswald scheme is continued. So you'll find when you go through Oswald's military record that he's in two places at once again through his entire military career. And the times that he's not, it's obvious there are big gaps in the record where we have the records of one of the Oswalds, but the other one, we don't know some of the things that he was, some of the places that he was, because we have witnesses who put him in Memphis, Tennessee at the aviation mechanic school, like where his brother went. But that's not on the official story. And the official story says he never went there and that he was a radar operator. But I've gone through all the documents and statements of all the people who knew him. I cannot put him behind a radar station ever. Not once. Most of the time, Oswald was in trouble. He was on administrative duty. He was seen more often than not working the mess hall or on guard duty or dumping garbage cans, because he was always in trouble. And so when you really dig through Oswald's Marine career, it becomes obvious, once again, there's two Oswalds in two different places who knew two totally different separate groups of friends, stayed at two different sets of Marine bases, and they went to great lengths to cover this stuff up. Great lengths, to the point where I even believe that they even murdered two brothers to cover this up. So when Oswald, the real Lee Oswald, was about 6 years old, he had a surgery on his ear. He had surgery on his ear, and that affected his hearing. And we have multiple documents from his school years showing that he had been tested for hearing and that he was hard of hearing in his left ear. And so when you start to dig into this is, I'm going to go off topic for a minute, but when you start to dig into like the autopsy stuff, Oswald doesn't have a scar behind his ear where he should, right? And Oswald shot himself in the left arm. That scar isn't there either. So all of the person who was, we were told was Lee Harvey Oswald, when he was autopsied, doesn't have most of the indicating marks that we can say for sure that Lee Oswald had growing up. But when Oswald had that surgery on his ear, it was clear that it became a big problem for him, which we don't really learn about until his school records in New York, that they did a lot of emphasis on his hard of hearing. So if you're hard of hearing, how are you going to get into the Marines? They're not going to let you in the Marines at all, right? So how did this guy who was hard of hearing in the left ear get into the Marines in the first place? And how is it that once he's in the Marines, they note the scar behind his ear, but they don't indicate he had any difficulty hearing? So you have a lot of almost like he wasn't qualified to be in there, but they forced it anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting.
Well, you have a chapter on David Ferry. He is my favorite eyebrows in the whole conspiracy. Most people will know him from that or the Kevin Costner movie. Talk a little bit about some of what you focus on surrounding this character.
So Ferry was the shooter behind the picket fence at the corner of the picket fence in Dealey Plaza, November 22nd. My book goes into excruciating detail on explaining everything regarding that. So his story is completely debunked when you go through everything. So allegedly he was in court with Carlos Marcello November 22nd. And then he drove to Houston, went ice skating, then went to Galveston, allegedly went goose hunting, and then made his way back to New Orleans, where Monday afternoon he is basically arrested by Jim Garrison. So this alibi story that he put forth about going ice skating in Houston never happened. It was an elaborate alibi story. And that story becomes very easily debunked once you start to get into the very fine details of witnesses to where David Ferry actually was when the assassination was going on and subsequent days. So his entire story is debunked because he went to a place in Hammond, Louisiana, Southeastern College, where he hid out with an associate of his named Thomas Compton. And now, according to Thomas Compton, Ferry didn't show up until Sunday, and he left on Monday. But thanks to Thomas Compton's roommate, a guy named Frank J. Chalona, who one of my associates has recently been in contact with to verify the story, Frank Chalona said that basically Ferry showed up and was in Hammond, Louisiana all weekend from Friday night all the way till Monday. And that's exactly what happened. So David Ferry shoots the president from the grassy knoll, and then he will end up making his way over to the Tippit shooting, where he's involved with the Tippit shooting with Carrie Thornley. And from there, he will flee, and he will end up in Hammond, Louisiana that Friday night. Now, he's not supposed to be in Hammond. He's supposed to be in Houston. He's supposed to have gone ice skating. And we have this big, long story about how he went ice skating on Saturday, and there was all kinds of witnesses. Well, it turns out that was an alibi story. The person who actually went to the ice skating rink was not David Ferry. It was an associate of his who was pretending to be David Ferry to provide him an alibi. And that alibi completely crumbles when you go through the statements of people who saw where David Ferry actually was that weekend. So David Ferry shoots Kennedy from the knoll, flees to Hammond, Louisiana, hangs out there all weekend while other people are laying out an alibi story for him. So that was one of the first things I actually tackled when I got into the Kennedy research, because it's the biggest, most important part of the story, and a lot of people just ignore it.
Another important aspect that I have never heard anyone else talk about that you have a chapter about is the mercenaries. Tell us a story behind this.
Yeah, so there are, you keep hearing when people talk about Kennedy, they talk about anti-Castro Cubans, and they talk about these mercenaries who were all hanging out in New Orleans, and these guys who were down at No Name Key, who were kind of like, CIA contractors, but they were disaffected by the CIA once the Bay of Pigs happened. And so a lot of these guys end up in New Orleans. And three of these guys in particular, Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall, and William Seymour, I do my chapter, The Mercenaries, on. These three guys are probably three of the most important names in the entire assassination. They were heavily involved in not only the setup of Oswald going back years, but they were most certainly in Dealey Plaza, and two out of those three were shooters in the book depository. And so these names, once you really start to dig into these names heavily, you'll come to find that they are definitely responsible for much of the setup of Oswald. So when you dig into the story of Oswald, after his return from the Soviet Union, what you find is that he is alleged to have done a whole bunch of things. He's alleged to have gone to the shooting range where he shot at other people's targets. He's alleged to have gone to the Carousel Club. He's alleged to have done 50 different things, right? Well, when you really start to understand the characters involved and what happened with Oswald, you come to realize he didn't do any of those things that we were told. None, including work at the book depository. So when you dig into the individual stories, you'll find that Oswald, there's two separate patterns that will emerge. One, you'll have Oswald, who's a real arrogant, cocky guy who's dirty with dirty fingernails, and he's constantly seen with a pregnant woman, sometimes a pregnant woman with a baby in the backseat of her car. That's one pattern that you'll see constantly. You'll see it at Furniture Mart. You'll see it in Alice, Texas at the radio station, Alice, Texas at the diner. We got about a half a dozen incidents where you'll see Oswald allegedly with his wife, but he's driving a car, and Oswald never drove a car. So you have that as one pattern. Another pattern is you'll see Oswald all over the place with a large, husky Latin male who has a pockmarked face or moles on his face. That you'll see at the Sportsdrome rifle range. That you'll see at the Carousel Club. That you'll see at the Havana Bar in New Orleans. So you have these two distinct patterns. The Oswald seen with the husky Latin everywhere is William Seymour, and the husky Latin is Lawrence Howard. He's a name that has been popped up in the Kennedy world for decades. No one's ever really focused on him, though. Very important person. Jim Garrison had first identified him as the Latin male who went to Bolton Ford, allegedly with Oswald, in February of 1961. And then he is seen in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 63. So what are we looking at? We're looking at 2.5 years that this husky Latin male, Lawrence Howard, is involved in a setup of something involving Lee Harvey Oswald, right? And so those are the two patterns you'll find. And then you'll find that the two men who were impersonating Oswald were Carrie Thornley and William Seymour. And once you understand that, and you understand the two patterns of Oswald sightings, all of them should really fall into place. And then that's when you come to realize, oh my God, Oswald had nothing to do with nothing, like nothing at all. And so that's another thing that I'm real heavy on in my thesis, is that Oswald was never told anything. He was kept at arm's length. Everything he did in New Orleans with Fair Play for Cuba Committee were assignments he was given, and he was told to hand these flyers out. Everything he was doing was under the direction of basically Carrie Thornley and Carrie Thornley's handlers, who I linked to a guy named Buddy Simcoe, and Buddy Simcoe's handler was a guy named Lieutenant Ballantyne, who all these guys were with Oswald in the Marines. And I believe that they played a major role in the perpetuation of the Oswald legend and setting him up for the assassination.
And you mentioned Carrie Thornley, who he's also in one of the chapters in the book. What is he primarily responsible for? You said it's for the planning of the setup of Oswald?
Right. So Carrie Thornley knew Oswald going back to March of 1959. They were both stationed together in Santa Ana, California, at the helicopter base out there. And so Oswald's time at Santa Ana gets complicated, not because of what he's doing, but because what people around him are doing and who is around him. And so I'm convinced that Carrie Thornley was given the assignment, recruited into the CIA before he joined the Marines. But while he's in the Marines, he's probably working with Naval Intelligence or CIA because they're kind of one organization at this point. But after Carrie Thornley is stationed with Oswald in California, he is then, only for about a month, maybe a month and a half, then he is sent to Atsugi, Japan, and he's placed in the unit that Oswald was in when Oswald was in Atsugi, Japan, before he went to California. So what happens once Carrie Thornley gets out to Atsugi, Japan? Well, he starts to use an alias of Rick Thornley for some reason, and he starts to take pictures and ask a lot of questions about Lee Harvey Oswald while he's over there. And this is all in early 1960. This is from like, I'd say June through like, I don't know, September in 1960. Then he comes back from Atsugi, Japan in October of 1960. He lies about when he first heard about Oswald's defection. He says he doesn't find out until he's on his way back to the States, which is a lie, because he obviously knew something was going on because he was trying to find out information about Oswald once he got over there, right? So he gets back, and according to him, he goes to Whittier, California, where his parents are, and he stays there for, I don't know, like 6 or 8 months. But that's a lie, because I have that Bolton Ford incident happened in February of 61, which is literally about a week and a half after Carrie Thornley allegedly gets back from the Marines. So it's just too close of an incident for it not to have been Carrie Thornley, right? That's why he lied about staying in Whittier, California. And so basically from that time period in February of 61, where it's way too soon for there to have been an assassination plot, way too soon, he's impersonating Oswald in a bunch of different places. You know, he even gets arrested and gives Oswald's name. Why is he doing this? Nobody knows. But the only logical explanation is that they were continuing to create this Oswald legend so he could try to defect to Cuba. That's the only thing that I can even think of. Nothing else makes any sense. They were not planning on killing Kennedy 2 years before he actually got killed. You know, so it's a very interesting thing. Why were they doing this? And so you end up with about a half a dozen or more incidents where Oswald is doing something in the States when he's actually still in the Soviet Union. And so Carrie Thornley's role, you know, it's funny because there's a time when Oswald comes back and he's living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And around end of April in 63, all of a sudden, for no reason, there's no explanation, he up and he moves back to New Orleans. Okay. Then at the end of September, again, for no reason, he just up and moves back to Fort Worth. We have no explanation on why he moved, period. You know, well, I think the official story is like he was trying to look for work and he couldn't find work in Fort Worth. Give me a break. Dallas-Fort Worth is way bigger than New Orleans. Okay. He definitely could have found a job. So it's all BS. The weird thing is that Carrie Thornley left New Orleans and went to Whittier, California, the same time that Oswald shows up back in New Orleans. Then when Oswald leaves New Orleans, Carrie Thornley shows back up in New Orleans. I'm talking within a couple days or a week, right? Another odd thing, this exact same time period, Robert Oswald is moved from his company. He works for the Acme Brick Company, which definitely has intelligence connections. He's moved from Fort Worth to Arkansas. And guess what? he ends up moving back to Fort Worth the exact same time that Lee Harvey Oswald does. So you got this weird 3 or 4 month period where people are moving around. A lot of the setup of Oswald was done during this time period. And so this is a big mystery to everybody still. Why was Oswald moved? Why did Carrie Thornley move at the exact same time? Why did Robert Oswald get moved at the exact same time? This 3 or 4 month period is a point of major fascination for me. But something was going on, right? We have more Oswald sightings in places he shouldn't be. Then we get weird things like Oswald gets signed into in July, he'll go to Mobile, Alabama, and he'll talk to the Jesuit college there about what it's like living in the Soviet Union. However, 2 days before he gives that speech, we have a document showing he was signed into the Atomic Energy Museum up in Knoxville, Tennessee. Okay. The entire establishment denies that this ever happened, but it's obvious that it did. We have his handwriting, like literally, like we have 100 documents that say Lee Harvey Oswald. Most of them aren't his handwriting. This one is clearly his handwriting. So we have Oswald going up to the Atomic Museum in Knoxville 2 days before he goes and talks at the Jesuit college, and yet everyone lies about it and tries to cover it up. Marina, all these people, the Lillian Moret, John Marshall Moret, who was also went to Mobile. All of them say, yeah, we were in New Orleans and we just drove up to Mobile. No. He ended up at the Atomic Energy Museum and people are trying to lie and cover it up. Why? I have no idea. A researcher years ago named Jennifer Lake put out an article called Atomic Agent Oswald, where she speculated that Oswald was actually part of his duties were atomic in nature and had something to do with checking in at the Atomic Energy Museum was part of his work that he was supposed to be doing that shouldn't have gotten out, but did. So Oswald, when you dig into like the various Oswald sightings, you'll find that he was doing things that don't match the person we know as Oswald, don't match what he should have been doing as a profession or career because he was really a bum, right? And so there's a ton of indicators that he had a job, that he was working for the government, doing something of importance. But the story we're told is he's just a loser and a bum and a dissident and all this stuff. So I feel really bad for Oswald because he never got a fair shake. Either of them, Harvey or Lee. They never had a choice in what they were doing. Their entire lives were dictated to them. And then, Oswald gets shot by Jack Ruby at the age of 24. It's a shame.
So far, you've done a great job finding this information in these old documents, but it seems that there's a lot of information that's become more difficult to get a hold of in recent years. Some things being deleted from the internet. Have you found it more difficult to find some of these old documents in recent years?
Yes, but not directly. What I've noticed is that in going back through just very recently, the past couple of weeks, I went through some old Rampart magazine stuff from the 70s and some old newspaper articles and this and that. And so what I've learned is that things that were accepted as fact, 30, 40, 50 years ago are now back open for debate, which to me is just ridiculous. So I'll give you an example. I explained that there's an incident at a woman's apartment named Sylvia Odio. Allegedly, Oswald shows up there with 2 Cubans and they talk about raising money for Cuba. And then there's a whole big controversy over whether it was Oswald who actually went to Sylvia Odio's. Well, it wasn't Oswald. It was William Seymour, Lauren Hall, and Lawrence Howard. They were there and they were setting Oswald up. This was part of the setup of Oswald. There were newspaper articles and there were magazine articles written about the Odio incident that basically was like, yeah, because Lauren Hall admitted to the FBI that it was them at Sylvia Odio's. And he was there with William Seymour and Lawrence Howard. He admitted it. There were newspaper articles written about his confession. There were magazine articles written about his confession. But yet today, for some reason, in 2026, you got stupid JFK research idiots out there who still debate who was at Odio's. Like, it's still up for debate in 2026 when it was settled 50 years ago. You know what I mean? So that pisses me off a lot. There's a lot of things that were accepted as truth and reality that we just knew, but now is back to being up for debate. It just goes to show you how stupid the JFK research community really is. They're so easily led around by the nose. All of them think we're going to get some new documents, and I this is another thing. I freaking hate the gimme the documents people. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. We're never getting documents that are of any value at all. Okay. They've given us a million pages of documents since 2017. None of them are any good. They're junk. Okay. They're garbage. They don't. Now, if you're just interested in the backdrop of the 60s and what was going on, they're great. It'll fill in all kinds of gaps on what was going on in the 1960s. Nothing to do with the assassination at all, like zero, you know? So, but there's people out there who are like, oh, we need the documents in order to solve this thing. And my response to them is a big fuck you. Okay. That's such bullshit. We don't need any more documents. And these people who are like begging for the documents, they couldn't even tell you what documents we need. I literally, in my head, I could name off at least a dozen documents right now that I am dying to have that I know I'll never have. Right. But these document people they couldn't even tell you that. They're just like, oh, we're supposed to have them all. So give it to us. Right. We can't solve it till we get all the documents. These people are idiots. So I have a major beef with the JFK research world because they're the dumbest people that I've ever come across in my life. Like, you'd think that there would be at least a handful of like high IQ individuals who are working on this thing. No, not at all. It's a bunch of idiots. I'm not even fucking playing. I know all of them. They're dumb. They're all dummies. It's really pathetic.
One of the most important testimonies that you cover in the book is from Cheramie, and this is something that, again, many researchers won't even bring to the forefront and cover, which it seems ridiculous not to. This seems to be a huge puzzle piece in this whole thing. For those that aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about this.
Sure. So Cheramie is like, she works for like the mob, basically. She's basically a kind of prostitute, drug mule, just kind of one of these, you know, hang-arounds with the mob. And so she's on a trip on the 20th, 2 days before the assassination. She's on a trip from Miami to Dallas, and she's with two guys who the names given were Osanto, and I forget the other alias, but it turns out it was two guys, Sergio Arcacha Smith and Emilio Santana. This is pretty much settled in the Kennedy world. So she's a real pain in the ass, and she's all strung out on heroin, and she's just a real, you know, she's a real witch. And so they end up ditching her at a club called the Silver Slipper down outside of New Orleans. And she ends up getting hit by a car, and she ends up getting taken to the hospital. So she's taken to the hospital. She starts telling people, she's all strung out and they can't really handle her. And so she starts telling people that they're going to kill Kennedy. They're going to kill Kennedy. Everyone's like not believing her. And they end up transferring her to the psych ward at the Jackson Hospital in Jackson, Louisiana. And so they transfer her to that, and they have a police lieutenant, Lieutenant Francis Fruge of the state police. He rides in the ambulance while she's transferred. While she's in the ambulance, she tells him the whole story about how she's with these guys. She got kicked out of the bar, and that these guys, they had to go pick up some heroin and do a whole bunch of other stuff and meet this guy coming in on a boat, and that the two guys she was with were on their way to Dallas to kill Kennedy. Okay. For many years, there was some like obfuscation over whether or not she really said that. But when you go through the documents, turns out, yes, she actually did really say that. And everyone knew that she said that. We have half a dozen people after the fact who like said, confirmed that she said that they were going to kill the president. So, of course, they don't believe her. She's in the mental ward. And then, of course, Kennedy gets killed and everyone freaks out. Francis Fruge freaks out. He's like, oh, my God. And he goes back to Jackson. And basically, he tries to get the story from her. She's still not really that lucid. But over the next couple of days, they determine who everybody was, who the sailor came in with the heroin. And they're not really able to do much, but they tried to find the heroin guy and all this stuff. And that's what we got. There's a lot of documents from the Cheramie stuff that are missing because in the body of those documents, Francis Fruge acknowledges that he identified everyone involved, but there's not a single page in any of the documents that has the true identifications. So you kind of had to figure that one out for yourself. The amount of cover up, even in the Jim Garrison files, is unbelievable. I'll be going through the Jim Garrison files, and it'll reference another file that he has, and you're like, this file doesn't exist. Where is it? You know, they ended up Jim Garrison. I think by the end of his, way after the Clay Shaw trial, but he continued the investigation for like 10 years. I think he pretty much knew exactly what happened, who the players were, all that stuff. A lot of his conclusions are that you find in the documents never made it into like the JFK film or any of that stuff, which is really a shame. But back to the Rose Cheramie story, the reason it's so important is because you can identify two of the shooters through that story, Sergio Arcacha and Emilio Santana. So, and those were the last two positions that I filled in the gaps on in Dealey Plaza on who shot from where and when. So that's why that story is so important.
I want to get your thoughts on where we're at as it relates to the operations that were all stepping stones to achieve this global domination by this parasitic ruling class. You were on to the fact that Israel was at the top of this power pyramid for a very long time, and there's been some profound revelations that have gotten people looking in this same direction recently. How do you feel about where we're at, the revelations, and what is unfolding right now on a world stage with Israel and Iran and all that shit?
So I despise what's going on today with Israel. I despise the fact that we're at a war with Iran on behalf of Israel, but simultaneously, the mask is off now. Now that we are in this war, they're uncovering the true atrocities that Israel has been committing for decades. It is Israel's not a real country. It's a shell country. It's like a shell company. If you could have a country that's a shell company, that's what Israel is. It was created so they could do all the illegal stuff that they couldn't do in America or anywhere else. And that's exactly what's going on today. So before, even just a year or two ago, I'd say Israel killed Kennedy. People would look at me like my hair's on fire. But now, because of what's going on in the Middle East, people are much more open to accepting and understanding that. Then once you really get into the details of the relationships between the Israelis back in the 40s, right, before there was even an Israel, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir and Rabin and Ben Gurion, once you understand that these guys were like bosom buddies with the mafia in the United States going back to like 45, 46, and that Kennedy was killed in 63, and that the mob and Israel were involved in the stealing of the nuclear material out of NUMEC in Apollo, Pennsylvania, the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation. It's like, oh my God, these guys, by the time that Kennedy was killed, the mob had been working with the Israelis for almost 20 years, 18 years at that point, So it's been a bittersweet, because I hate to see Americans die for a war for Israel, but at the same time, this war has allowed everyone to peek behind the curtain of what's really goes on in Israel. And I think that's great, and it's priceless.
Do you think the structure of the mob that's portrayed in cinema and by the mainstream is backwards in a sense that Israel is giving orders to the Italians? The Italians are just there working for them.
Well, from what I've come to understand, the Italians ran the local mafias, like, Marcello's in New Orleans, Traficante's in Tampa. They might have had their outcroppings in other places, but those guys were local mafia. The larger scale international syndicate was controlled by the Jews, 100%. And in particular, Meyer Lansky. And then when you follow the history of Meyer Lansky, you realize he was a big shot in New York. He's the one who established the commission, but didn't put himself on the commission. He was definitely involved in the creation of Permindex, the Mossad front company that oversaw the assassination, and didn't give himself a seat on Permindex. He's the guy who led from behind. You know what I mean? He always made it seem like he was just the mob's accountant, but no, he ran the show. And all of his people, he had Hyman Lerner was like his associate who ran Chicago. Like everyone thinks Giancana ran Chicago, but Giancana answered to Hyman Lerner. Hyman Lerner answered to Meyer Lansky. So Meyer Lansky was the boss of all bosses of the mafia for like 40 years. And then in the 70s, when we finally go after him, he goes on the run, and they won't let him into Israel, but Israel gave him a travel visa so he could continue to run from the government.
Would you say that the Dimona nuclear issue was the primary factor that pushed Israel to do the assassination?
Well, it's a cascading issue, and I'll explain that by saying Damona was the catalyst, but ultimately it was more than that. It was Kennedy was going to cut aid to Israel. That was what it was about. When you go through what's called the Battle of Letters, which is the exchange of letters that happened between Ben-Gurion and Kennedy in April and May of 1963, then continued by Levi Eshkol, what you'll find is that the nuclear problem was the biggest concern for Kennedy in the world, period. That was his number one concern with everything. He wanted the Russians to get rid of nukes. And then if he's trying to negotiate with Khrushchev to get rid of the nukes, but then you got this pissant little country developing them behind everyone's back, that kind of like throws a wrench into the works, right? So it became a huge deal. Going back to 1960, before Kennedy was even in office, there are documents showing that they were keeping very detailed records on the Israelis, what they were doing about Damona, any kind of communications about Damona. So by the time Kennedy takes office in early 61, he's already got stacks of papers showing all the history of the Damona nuclear reactor going back to like 58. They didn't have much before that. But he basically threatened Ben-Gurion to the point where Ben-Gurion stepped down. And this is in May of 1963. By May of 63, the assassination plot was well underway for at least 3 or 4 months, possibly longer. And so I think that Ben-Gurion stepped down, number one, because he was forced to, but also because he didn't want to be associated with the upcoming assassination that he knew was happening, right? So, yes, Damona was the catalyst, but really it was about funding. It was about cutting funding to Israel, because if you cut funding to Israel, guess what? They're dead. They're done. They can't survive without our money.
Do you think, depending on the outcome of this current conflict, that Israel may ultimately lose some of its power over the planet?
I think it already has. That's already begun. There has to be no Israel, and that land has to be given back to the Palestinians. Period. That I will not be happy until that's the outcome. One state solution, a Palestinian state. So is that going to happen? You know, I hate to say it, but Iran is our only hope for doing something like that, right? So we still don't even have proof of life of Netanyahu or any of these guys. So you got to remember, go back like a month, and we got reports. Netanyahu got hit. Ben-Gvir got hit. All the top guys, we got word that they got hit. And then they started coming out with these AI videos of these guys doing stuff, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like with extra fingers and stuff. And so like nobody has any idea. We've never been in a fog of war this dense ever in the history of warfare. We've never had our government outright lying to us. You know what? The government still says that we've only lost 13 to 15 servicemen in this war.
That's
Iran says we've lost like 650. So how the fuck do they? This is a huge divide. Where's the news? Have the families been notified? Like, we don't have a clue what's going on. But the Israelis are like fucking cockroaches. Like, it seems like you can step on all of them and they'll just keep coming back. And the problem is, even once, let's just say Israel gets destroyed, then the problem will shift to people who support Israel around the world will become the problem. You know, it'll become a diaspora for Israel, and it'll become a very big problem for everyone.
So what is next for you and your research? Are you going to continue with the JFK research?
Oh, I've got years booked ahead of me already, man. So I will finish up volume 2 of A Warning from History within the next, I'd say, 10 days. Once that is done and published and everything's good, I can go back to my work on Oswald. And I plan on having another book out this year by October, the Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White Volume 2. So as it stands, that is going to be a 4-book set. All the research for the first 2 books is done. And so I'm anxious to get volume 2 finished, because that will leave me Oswald in the Soviet Union and Oswald from June 62 till the end, which in my opinion should be, when it comes to Oswald, the most important stuff. So honestly, what year is it? 2026. I am probably booked full on my research for at least 2 more years to 2028 or 2029, because I have to actually do the research from scratch when I get to the Soviet Union. And I figure that will take me about 6 months to absorb everything, and then 6 months to write the book. So figure a year on volume 3 and a year on the volume 4 might be even worse. That might even be a 2-year book, because there's so much that goes on between June 62 and the end. and we have a lot of Oswald's chronology already set, but I have a feeling a lot of it's wrong. So I think that to me is going to be the most important book I write, Oswald from 62 to the end, because that will debunk any concerns people have, or any last comments, or any last problems with Oswald and the assassination. I hope to solve every last little detail when I go through that last 18 months of his life. So that's what I got going on. And then I'd like to get to Martin Luther King. One of these years, maybe by 2030, I can get to Martin Luther King. So,
well, right on, man. You also have Day Zero, Bloody History. Let the audience know how they can get a hold of you and find all your content.
Yeah, CoryHughes.org is the best place to go. But like my podcast is Cory Hughes Bloody History, and it's been doing really good. This month in particular is doing really good. So, and then I do Day Zero on Sundays, and then I do Beyond the Cube on Thursdays with X Cube. And okay, so I was doing the Morals and Dogma on the Freemasons podcast because I had to get to the bottom of it, and unfortunately, I got to the bottom of it in like 5 episodes. It's the Jews. Okay, it is the Freemasons is a Jewish recruitment mechanism, and it's all about Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, 100%. And so I gave up on that because I'm just disgusted by that whole thing. I don't want nothing to do with it. But there's 4 or 5 episodes that are pretty decent, going through the Morals and Dogma book. But that whole Freemason thing pisses me off to no end. Those people are like, I don't know, weak-minded, weak-willed, whatever. They got to go along with the flow. I don't know. But I'm very much interested in completing this work on Lee Harvey Oswald in the next couple of years. That's my number one priority.
Excellent. Cory, thank you so much. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We will talk again tomorrow. See y'all then. Watch Doors of Perception, now on Amazon Prime. Are you and your family prepared for an emergency? Maybe the fake alien invasion? Now is the time to prepare yourself and your family for any event. Check out Prep Starts Now. Their mission is to provide high-quality preparedness products that empower individuals and families to be ready for any situation. They're committed to delivering reliable, trusted gear to ensure your safety, security, and peace of mind in times of need. Their product selection is carefully curated to provide you with the essential gear you need to stay prepared. From emergency kits to tactical tools, every item is chosen for its reliability and practicality. Prep Starts Now understands the importance of family, and their goal is to equip you with everything you need to build a solid plan for your family's preparedness. In today's ever-changing world, being prepared is more important than ever, and Prep Starts Now is here to help you and your family stay ready with quality products and practical guidance. Use the link in the description and get 15% off your order. Watch Doors of Perception, now on Amazon Prime. We live in an incredible age of information. More and more, we're discovering that we've been lied to and misled about much of our human history. Cory Hughes is providing profound revelations about World War I, World War II, the JFK assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, and much, much more on his new Substack, Bloody History. Subscribe now for as little as $5 monthly. Just click that link right in the description to get started now and learn about our true history. Hello, friends. If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey, knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order. Hello, friends. Are you struggling to lose weight and keep it off? Have you tried intermittent fasting, low-carb or ketogenic diets, cutting calories, and exercising more with no success? Book a free intro call with my friend Christian Yordanov to see how he can help you. He is a health author and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. He was on the show recently to discuss his latest book on longevity, How to Actually Live Longer, Volume 1. He understands that for many people, excess weight gain and weight loss resistance is much more complex than calories in, calories out. You may be having a hard time shedding the pounds because of hormonal and metabolic imbalance.